It's now my pleasure to introduce Adam Liaw to the stage. Adam is a chef, writer, and television presenter. He's the author of 5 cookbooks. His television series Destination Flavour has ventured through Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Scandinavia, and Singapore. In 2010, Adam won MasterChef Australia. His victory is to this day one of the most watched television events in Australian history. In 2016, the Japanese government appointed Adam as an official goodwill ambassador of Japanese cuisine. Please welcome Adam Liaw.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the introduction. And as I look around the esteemed company in the room, I truly wonder whether the number of cookbooks I've written is a measure that's going to impress all of you. But I cannot impress on you all how proud I am to have been asked to give the keynote address here tonight. I'm standing in front of a room that represents, to my mind, a large part of the future of Australia. I'm in a room of Asian Australians excelling in their fields, as well as, if today's news reports are an indication, quite possibly also a handful of Chinese Communist Party spies. When I was growing up, this was a room that I didn't think existed. And I didn't think it existed because it didn't exist. When I grew up, there wasn't really a concept of being Asian Australian full stop. And the concept of Asian Australian excellence, I think you can forget about it. Of course, I know that Asian Australians existed. Asians have been coming to Australia even before Europeans have. But when I was growing up, Asian and Australian were 2 separate things. You could hardly be both at the same time. Total assimilation was the only game in town. You played footy and didn't have an accent, you were just like an Aussie. Your family had been here for 3 generations, you were basically Australian. And the language mattered because being just like an Aussie and being basically Australian meant that you weren't. In order to be more Australian, you had to be less Asian. And of course, no matter how much beer you could drink or how little of your parents' language you could speak, you could never change the way that people looked at you. As a kid, the question of my identity was a difficult one. I'm of mixed race, born in Malaysia to parents of primarily English and Chinese heritage. As a kid, I did buy into that idea of exclusivity. I thought that to be more Australian, I had to be less Asian. As an adult, of course, I know that the more I embrace my heritage, the more Australian I feel. Because that's who I am, that's who we are. Of course, I've experienced racism and discrimination. I bet nearly half the people in this room have a story to tell about that. It'd be a sure bet too, because that's precisely what the concept papers for this summit bear out. And of course, I empathise with stories of racial vilification and discrimination. But for the purposes of what we are all here in this room trying to achieve, to be honest, I don't think they're particularly relevant. The drunken idiots hurling broken beer bottles at me as I was 13 years old rowing down the Torrens River at school rowing camp never turned me down for a job. They never, ever stood in the way of my success. We need to get past the idea of racism as just people calling other people bad names on a bus. We need to get past the idea that fixing racists, in inverted commas, is going to fix the systemic problems our country has with race. There's no bad guy manning the barricades to our participation. The bamboo ceiling isn't something that we have to convince somebody to take away. Both it and other areas of systemic inequality are part of a system we are all part of, regardless of race, and we must address them together for the good of us all. These inequalities are part of a system in large part that's built on fear. As a nation, our fear of Asian Australian diversity has hurt us before. It's nearly crippled us before. Public fear. At the turn of the century, our country had an abundance of Asian workers. From telegraphs to railways to goldfields, they were engaged in the literal process of building our nation. Public fear of Asians taking our jobs became a political movement. We brought into effect a series of measures that became known as the White Australia policy. Half a century later, the post-war global economy experienced what we can call the golden age of capitalism. Other multicultural allied nations grew and prospered at an unprecedented rate as a result of a burgeoning middle class and enormous consumer demand. But by and large, we were left behind. So far behind that we had to beg people to come here, to populate or perish. The assisted passage scheme gave us £10 poms. Come one, come all. We'll even pay for your ride as long as you're white. It would take 30 more years to unwind the last vestiges of the white Australia policy. And ironically, for a country terrified of people coming by boat, we largely missed ours. Where would we be today if it wasn't for the historical myopia of that policy? Where would our economy be? Where would our culture be? How differently would we be looking at the Asian century? We're nearly a fifth of the way into it already. And it's frustrating to see that in many quarters we're still discussing whether there even is a bamboo ceiling, whether there is an ethnic wage gap. We are truly running out of time to capitalise on our assets, our talent, and our opportunities. And this summit could not be any more necessary or more timely than right now. But more to the point of missed opportunities in the past, are we going to allow our fear to get the better of us again? The fear of Asians taking our jobs is very much still here. As someone who 10 years ago once won a reality TV cooking competition by taking a job away from an extremely adorable young country lad, I know this all too well. At the time, one keen online commentator noted that me winning MasterChef would be bad for our economy because I would simply take all of my winnings and send them to China. I didn't do that, of course, but given contemporary concerns, I suspect it would be a source of even greater anger for that person to know that instead I put the money towards buying property in Sydney. We might laugh, but here we are. Asians are still taking our jobs, they're taking our baby formula, they're buying our houses for millions of dollary-doos. Are we really going to look at billions of Asian investment in our country as a threat? In the 1980s, before diversity was a public consideration, the United States and other countries grappled with the idea of how to access Japan's bubble economy. Executives were sent to language classes to bumble their way through konnichiwa and otsukare-sama. They studied manuals of how to properly bow to executives of varying rank. They took courses in how to use chopsticks. These are efforts that to modern understanding sound almost laughable. Yet over the past decades, both in private practice as a lawyer, in corporate life, and in this kind of weird cooking career that I have now, barely a day has gone by where I haven't been asked by one organisation of another how to crack into the inscrutable, mysterious markets of powerhouse economies like China and India, or emerging ones like Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Here in Australia, we have a ready-made talent pool for whom these markets are not inscrutable, are not mysterious. Many of those people are here in this room, and yet too many organisations are going into the game with their best players on the bench. And what about education? Are we going to look at thousands of Asian students in our universities building lifelong ties to our country, not as a phenomenal opportunity, but instead as devaluing the very institutions that they attend? This year I've been working closely with DFAT as an ambassador for the Australia Now program, travelling throughout Southeast Asia and engaging on Australian trade, opportunity, aid, and culture. Throughout the region, the concept of Australian alumni is one of the strongest commercial, social, and political associations that you can have. And by that term, I mean people who have studied here, worked here, have people who have children who are also studying and working here even now. Many have family members who have become citizens or permanent residents of our country. In their home countries, these Australian alumni are politicians, journalists, and captains of industry. They are one of our most vital resources of soft power, of direct trade, and of economic opportunity. And yet our national discourse includes calls to scrap it all because our fear leads us to want to blame Asians for, of all things, peak hour traffic. It absolutely beggars belief. The opportunities for Asian Australian leadership in this country are obvious, as are the challenges. Our nation's security in a changing world is of paramount importance, and I make absolutely no comment on the events of today's political sideshow, I'm sure there'll be a lot more to play out on that over the coming days and weeks. Safe to say that some days ago I had written a joke here about how half of this room was going to be on an ASIO watch list and the other half on a Chinese Communist Party watch list that now seems deeply inappropriate and eerily prescient. As countries like China increase their projection of both economic and political power, and as Asian Australians grow in prominence and public profile, the scrutiny on us will be increasingly and often grossly unfair. Professionally and privately, we'll be called to account for the actions of foreign countries and people to which and whom we owe no allegiance and have no connection besides sharing an ethnic background. I know this because it's happening right now. Again, this is no reference to our domestic politics of the day, but I've seen Asian Australians just in the past few weeks vocally supporting the protesters in Hong Kong while at the same time being bizarrely called agents of the Chinese government. I've been called the same because my documentary series on Chinese food for SBS didn't include an expose of Uyghur camps in Xinjiang. I've even, quite oddly, been called the same in regard to Malaysia because a nature documentary that I narrated that was filmed entirely by an overhead drone didn't cover the sodomy trial of Anwar Ibrahim 20 years ago. In the United States, the implication that Jewish Americans somehow hold dual loyalties to Israel and the United States is considered an anti-Semitic trope. People are aware of it, and they see how it erodes trust based entirely on race. We have little history with it here, but we're going to have to learn very quickly. Despite the challenges, the future of Asian Australian leadership must be on our own terms. Nobody in this room is Oliver Twist, standing pitifully with an empty bowl, asking for more. Our future is not about begging for a fair go, it's about what we have to offer. It's about our leadership. There was once an idea that's now widely debunked, that human beings used only 10% of their brains. And we asked ourselves, what could we achieve if we could unlock that remaining 90%? Would we read minds, have the power of telekinesis? Would we even live forever? Modern science has thankfully shown that idea to be false. But what do we think of a nation that chooses to engage only 10% of its talent? These figures are rough, so excuse me, but males over the age of 50 of Anglo-Celtic and European heritage in Australia comprise roughly 10% of the Australian population, but hold almost all senior executive leadership positions. Just imagine what we could achieve as a nation if we chose to use our whole brain. Thank you.